The afternoon of November 17th, 1944, brought a moment that would fundamentally alter the balance of armoured combat in Southeast Asia. In the muddy approaches to a Burmese town, a Japanese tank commander sat confident in his vehicle, believing he understood the capabilities of his adversaries. Years of study had taught him the limitations of American tank guns, and he knew his newer model tank could withstand hits at medium ranges. What he failed to anticipate was that the Allied forces had introduced an entirely different weapon system to the theatre. The tank that moved into firing position that day wasn't equipped with the standard American weapon. Instead, it carried a British anti-tank gun capable of defeating substantially thicker armour at distances exceeding 1,000 yards. In moments of engagement, the Japanese tank was completely destroyed. The interior became a catastrophic environment of superheated fragments moving at tremendous velocity. This single encounter demonstrated that 3 years of carefully developed tactical doctrine had become instantly obsolete. This weapon system had originally been designed for European battlefields, intended to counter the heavily armoured German vehicles encountered in France. However, intelligence reports from Burma in late 1944 revealed a concerning development. Japanese industry had finally produced tanks capable of challenging Allied armour on more equal terms. These newer Japanese vehicles mounted high-velocity guns derived from field artillery pieces, capable of penetrating significant armour thickness at combat distances. More importantly, their frontal protection could resist standard American tank guns at ranges beyond 500 yards. For the first time since early Pacific campaigns, American tank crews faced opponents requiring genuine tactical sophistication rather than simple firepower advantage. Allied tank casualties in Burma during October 1944 had risen dramatically. A British armoured regiment operating American tanks reported losing 3 vehicles in a single engagement, all struck by high-velocity rounds at ranges where their own weapons proved ineffective. The solution arrived at Indian port facilities in early November. 12 modified tanks had been diverted from European operations. These vehicles featured distinctive elongated gun barrels extending nearly 3 feet beyond standard dimensions. The weapon represented exceptional British ordnance engineering, originally designed as a towed anti-tank gun in 1942. Technical documentation revealed revolutionary capabilities. The weapon fired 17-pound projectiles at muzzle velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, it could defeat 140 millimeters of homogeneous armor plate. The newest Japanese tanks had maximum armor thickness of only 50 millimeters. The mathematical reality was unforgiving. These modified tanks could destroy any Japanese armored vehicle from ranges where Japanese weapons couldn't effectively respond. However, mounting such a powerful gun required extensive modification. The tremendous recoil necessitated redesigned recoil systems. Turret interiors were reconfigured, reducing crew size. Ammunition capacity decreased, but each round carried exponentially more destructive potential. The vehicles were assigned to an Indian Army armoured regiment that had been operating in Burma since early 1944. The commanding officer immediately recognized these weren't simply improved tanks, but represented a fundamental shift in tactical possibilities. For 3 years, Allied armor in the Pacific had relied on numerical superiority and infantry support. These modified vehicles offered something different, the ability to destroy enemy armor before it could effectively engage. Training commenced immediately. Crews quickly discovered the weapon's characteristics. Made rapid fire nearly impossible, the entire vehicle would rock backward with each shot. Muzzle blast created massive dust signatures revealing position instantly. The extended barrel made maneuvering in jungle terrain treacherous. European tactical doctrine would require adaptation for jungle warfare. Live-fire exercises against captured Japanese tanks positioned at various ranges exceeded optimistic predictions. At 1,200 yards, far beyond where Japanese tanks could accurately return fire, the first shot penetrated completely through captured vehicles' frontal armor, exited through rear plates, and continued another 50 yards. The armor-piercing rounds encountered so little resistance they barely deformed. A veteran gunnery instructor documented the engagement in training reports, noting the weapon didn't just penetrate armor, but obliterated it. Entry holes were clean, but interior damage was Fragmentation alone would be lethal, but shots typically continued through multiple internal components before exiting. Japanese tanks weren't constructed to withstand such kinetic energy. The psychological impact would prove as significant as physical destruction. Since 1942, Japanese armor tactics had evolved around understanding that American tanks, while numerous, weren't significantly superior in individual engagements. Japanese commanders had developed aggressive tactics, close rapidly to negate numerical advantages, use terrain for ambush positions, and accept calculated risks, knowing Japanese guns could penetrate American armor at typical combat ranges. These modified British tanks invalidated every assumption in that doctrine. Japanese intelligence reports intercepted by Allied signals intelligence revealed growing confusion. Reports from tank regiments noted enemy deployment of new variants with extended gun barrels, with engagement ranges appearing to exceed capability to respond effectively. Requests for technical assessment and tactical guidance went unanswered. Japanese military intelligence, already struggling with information from collapsing fronts across the Pacific, couldn't immediately determine what they faced. Some analysts theorized the British had mounted naval guns on tank chassis, technically accurate as the weapon derived from anti-aircraft gun designs. Others suggested different American guns, not realizing the weapon was far more powerful. First combat deployment. In mid-November, Japanese forces launched a counterattack with intelligence indicating their newest medium tanks would support the assault. The British commander made an immediate decision to commit the modified tanks to combat despite incomplete training. 4 vehicles moved into defensive positions along expected Japanese approach routes. Each tank was positioned in carefully prepared hold-down positions with only turrets visible. Standard tanks formed a second defensive line 400 yards behind, positioned to provide supporting fire and create illusion of typical defensive deployment. The tactical plan was elegantly simple. Modified tanks would engage enemy armor at maximum effective range, targeting command vehicles first. Standard tanks would not engage until enemy armor closed to within 500 yards, maintaining deception regarding new capabilities as long as tactically feasible. The Japanese attack commenced with artillery barrage. When guns fell silent, reconnaissance reported movements along multiple approach routes. Leading the advance came 6 of Japan's newest medium tanks, moving with confidence of crews believing themselves in technically superior vehicles. The British gunner in the lead modified tank acquired his target through telescopic sight at 920 yards, well beyond effective range for Japanese return fire. The target moved at approximately 8 miles per hour, presenting slight angle while negotiating a road curve. The gunner, having fired exactly 17 practice rounds during training, squeezed the trigger. The modified tank rocked backward violently, dirt and debris exploding from muzzle blast. Through the dust cloud, the gunner maintained sight picture long enough to see results. The armor-piercing round struck the Japanese tank's turret ring at slight downward angle. Kinetic energy exceeding 2 million foot-pounds at impact didn't just penetrate the 50mm armor but punched through effortlessly. The hardened steel shot continued through the fighting compartment at supersonic velocity. Inside the Japanese tank, crew had approximately 0.003 of a second of awareness before death. The shot itself created pressure waves rupturing internal organs. Fragments of the tank's own armor blown inward at lethal velocity filled the crew compartment like shrapnel. Ammunition storage, compromised by the penetrating shot, detonated 3 seconds later. The turret, weighing nearly 2 tons, lifted 15 feet into the air before crashing to Earth 20 feet from the burning hull. The remaining Japanese commanders witnessed their lead tank's destruction without comprehension. Japanese tactical doctrine had no framework for understanding what had occurred. Engagement range exceeded anything in their manuals. The violence of the kill, with turret literally blown off the hull, suggested ammunition detonation. But initial penetration had come from a single shot at a range where return fire should have been impossible. The second Japanese commander made a decision that would have been tactically sound against standard American tanks. Advance rapidly to close the range gap. His weapon could reliably penetrate Allied armor. He needed to cover 300 yards as quickly as possible. He ordered maximum speed, approximately 15 miles per hour on muddy roads. Another modified British tank engaged at 870 yards. The shot struck the sloped frontal armor at slight angle. The tremendous velocity meant even angled impact provided insufficient deflection. The round punched through, continued through the driver's compartment, through the engine firewall, and detonated the engine's fuel system. The Japanese tank became a fireball in less than 2 seconds. No crew members escaped. The Japanese formation, having lost 2 tanks in as many minutes to an invisible enemy firing from impossible ranges, began breaking formation. Individual commanders made independent decisions. Some attempted to reverse, others tried to identify firing positions. One accelerated forward in what may have been a deliberate suicide charge towards suspected enemy positions. Additional kills came in rapid succession. Within minutes, 5 of the 6 Japanese tanks were burning hulks. The surviving tank, commanded by a veteran who had fought in China since 1937, attempted something desperate and tactically brilliant. He drove directly into dense bamboo vegetation, using it to mask movement, hoping to close to knife-fighting range where Japanese gunnery skills might provide advantage. He almost succeeded. The Japanese tank emerged from bamboo at 380 yards, well within its effective range. The commander had a clear shot at a modified British tank's flank. In conventional engagement against standard vehicles, this would have been a kill shot. However, the modified tank's gun traverse was faster than the Japanese commander anticipated. The final Japanese tank died at point-blank range, the powerful round passing completely through from side to side. The exit hole twice the diameter of the entry wound. The entire engagement lasted 7 minutes and 40 seconds. 6 newer Japanese medium tanks, representing hundreds of thousands of yen in development costs and months in manufacturing effort, had been destroyed without damaging a single Allied vehicle. Japanese infantry, witnessing destruction of their armoured support from 600 yards away, began withdrawing before even reaching Allied positions. The psychological impact was immediate and catastrophic. After-action reports filed the following day documented not just tactical victory but fundamental shift in armoured warfare dynamics. The assessment was clinical. These modified tanks possess standoff capability, rendering current Japanese armor tactically obsolete. Enemy tanks must close to effective range where they were vulnerable to destruction before achieving firing solutions. This created a zone of absolute dominance between 600 and 1200 yards where Japanese armor could be engaged with impunity. British intelligence officers examining destroyed Japanese tanks made detailed damage assessments. technical officers documented findings that would circulate through Allied command structures within days. The weapon's penetration characteristics exceeded all previous estimates. Against Japanese armor, there was no effective protection at any combat range. The newest Japanese tank's frontal armor provided no more resistance than earlier models' thinner plates. Allied forces were not fighting superior tanks but using superior weapons. Japanese intelligence, piecing together reports from survivors and reconnaissance elements, began grasping the problem's magnitude. Intercepted communications revealed conversations between armor commanders describing how entire companies had been destroyed in single engagements with no survivors from tank crews. Infantry reports described enemy firing from ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Requests for immediate withdrawal of remaining armor until countermeasures developed were transmitted. The countermeasures never materialized. Free Japanese industry, already struggling to maintain basic production levels under sustained Allied bombing, couldn't redesign tank armor or develop new weapon systems. The newest Japanese tank represented the pinnacle of achievable development. There would be no answer to these modified British vehicles. In late November, Allied forces launched major offensive operations. The modified tanks, now integrated into standard tank formations at a ratio of 1 modified vehicle per 4 standard tanks, provided overwatch for advancing columns. Japanese commanders, having received warnings about new Allied tanks, ordered their armor to avoid engagement whenever possible. This defensive posture represented complete reversal of Japanese armored doctrine. The psychological transformation was documented in captured Japanese orders. Directives stated tank units would not engage enemy armor beyond 400 meters. They should close rapidly using terrain masking, accepting casualties during approach to achieve firing range where their weapons could penetrate enemy armor. Night operations were preferred to reduce enemy standoff advantage. These tactics, born of desperation, proved marginally more effective but ultimately futile. In early December, a Japanese tank platoon attempted dawn attack using morning fog to mask approach. They achieved surprise, closing to within 300 yards before detection. In the engagement that followed, 3 Japanese tanks were destroyed within 90 seconds. The modified British tank crews had adapted, maintaining constant readiness and developing rapid engagement protocols. A tank commander described the engagement in his personal diary, noting they spotted movement at first light. Japanese tanks emerged from fogbank at close range with no time for careful aim. First shot missed, 2 rushed. Second shot hit target center mass. Tank brewed up immediately. Third enemy tank attempted to ram their position, destroyed at 50 yards. The powerful weapon didn't miss at that range. There was nowhere for Japanese crews to hide. By mid-December, Japanese armor activity in Burma had decreased by over 70% compared to October levels. The few remaining newer Japanese tanks were being held in reserve, their crews increasingly reluctant to commit to engagements where survival odds approached 0. Allied intelligence reports noted Japanese tanks were being dug into static defensive positions, essentially converted into pillboxes, an admission that mobile armored warfare was no longer viable. Strategic implications extended beyond Burma. Reports of the modified tank's effectiveness reached Japanese Imperial headquarters by early December. Planning for defense of home islands had assumed Japanese armor, supported by prepared positions and intimate knowledge of terrain, could contest American landings effectively. The Burma report shattered that assumption. If Japanese tanks couldn't survive in open terrain against Allied armor, how would they fare in close terrain against an enemy with unlimited artillery and air support? The December battle demonstrated the modified tank's impact on combined arms operations. Japanese forces had fortified a town extensively with infantry positions supported by 6 newer tanks, positioned in prepared defensive positions. Allied planners developed deliberate approach. Would systematically eliminate Japanese armor from standoff range before infantry assaulted the town itself. The operation began with aerial reconnaissance confirming Japanese tank position. Modified British tanks maneuvered to positions offering clear fields of fire at ranges between 800 and 1,000 yards. The Japanese tanks dug in with only turrets exposed, presented difficult targets, but the weapon's accuracy at extended range proved decisive. Within 90 minutes, all 6 Japanese tanks were destroyed without closing to effective firing range. Allied infantry entered that afternoon against resistance that, while determined, lacked the armoured support that might have made defence sustainable. Post-battle interrogation of Japanese prisoners revealed psychological impact of facing these modified vehicles. A tank sergeant who had served in multiple theatres provided testimony that Allied intelligence found particularly significant. He stated they had trained to fight American tanks, studied their tactics, ranges and weaknesses. But these new tanks killed from distances they couldn't even see clearly. His commander said it was like fighting ghosts. You hear the shot and your comrade's tank explodes. You never see the enemy who killed him. The testimony revealed something deeper than tactical frustration. It showed how the modified British tanks had broken the psychological contract that made armoured warfare comprehensible to Japanese crews. Tank combat had always involved mutual risk. Both sides could kill each other, and victory went to those with better training, tactics, or courage. These modified tanks eliminated mutuality. Japanese tanks were targets, not opponents. This realization was corroding Japanese armor morale throughout Burma. By January 1945, the transformation was complete. Japanese armor doctrine had evolved from aggressive mobile warfare to passive defense. Remaining tanks were being used as static pillboxes, their mobility advantage sacrificed in exchange for improved protection from prepared positions. But even this proved inadequate. During operations in mid-January, a modified British tank engaged and destroyed a dug-in Japanese tank at 1,240 yards, the longest confirmed kill of the Burma campaign. The Japanese tank had been positioned in what its crew believed was an invulnerable hull-down position. The weapon's trajectory was flat enough at that range that the turret remained vulnerable. One shot, one kill. Allied armour losses during this period fell dramatically. Between December 1944 and March 1945, the regiment operating modified tanks reported 0 losses to Japanese tank fire. Infantry casualties decreased as well. Without effective armour support, Japanese defensive positions became easier to reduce through conventional combined arms tactics. The modified British tanks hadn't just one tank versus tank engagements. They had broken the entire defensive system that Japanese forces had built around armoured strongpoints. Strategic implications rippled through Allied planning for subsequent operations. Success in Burma demonstrated Japanese armour, even their most advanced types, couldn't contest Allied dominance when confronted with superior gunnery technology. Planning for operations in the Philippines, Okinawa, and potentially the home islands incorporated lessons from these modified tanks' performance. Japanese armour was reassessed from significant threat, requiring dedicated anti-tank resources to minor obstacle, manageable with standard combat procedures. March 1945 saw the final major armoured engagement in Burma. Japanese forces attempting to delay Allied advances committed their remaining armour reserve to a counterattack. The engagement was brief and one-sided. 4 modified British tanks supported by standard vehicles destroyed all 8 Japanese tanks in 17 minutes. No Allied tanks were damaged. Japanese infantry, witnessing the annihilation of their armoured support, began surrendering in unprecedented numbers. Over 300 prisoners taken in a single day, many citing the futility of resistance without effective armour support. The last recorded engagement against Japanese armour in Burma occurred in late March. A single Japanese tank, apparently abandoned earlier and recruited by desperate soldiers, attempted to ambush an Allied convoy. The tank was destroyed at 670 yards by a modified British tank that had been trailing the convoy specifically as protection against such attacks. The Japanese crew, according to witnesses, never managed to fire their main gun. Post-war assessment of these modified tanks' impact on Pacific armoured warfare began almost immediately after Japan's surrender. British and American armour analysts conducted extensive studies of tank engagements throughout the Burma campaign. These statistics were remarkable. Between November 1944 and August 1945, These modified tanks operating in Southeast Asia engaged Japanese armor in 47 documented encounters. The kill-to-loss ratio exceeded 30-1. More significantly, not a single modified tank was destroyed by Japanese tank fire during this period. The few losses that occurred resulted from mines, artillery, or mechanical failure, never from armor versus armor combat. The commanding general of British forces in Burma addressed the modified tank's contribution in his post-war memoirs. The introduction of these vehicles fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of armored operations. Japanese forces, which had shown consistent ability to adapt to Allied tactics throughout the war, found themselves confronting a weapon for which no tactical adaptation was possible. The combination of standoff range, penetrating power, and relative mobility created a weapon system that Japanese armor simply could not counter with available resources. Technical lessons learned from operations in Burma influenced post-war tank development across multiple nations. The principle of mounting the most powerful gun practically achievable in a medium tank chassis, even at the cost of some internal space and ammunition capacity, became standard doctrine. Soviet, American, and British tank development in the immediate post-war period all reflected this philosophy. The era of adequate tank guns had ended. These modified British tanks had demonstrated that overwhelming gun power provided decisive advantage. Japanese military analysts during post-war interrogations provided remarkably candid assessments. A colonel who had commanded Japanese armored forces in central Burma testified that their tank development proceeded on the assumption that engagement ranges would be limited by terrain and tactical doctrine to 500 meters or less. Their newest tank was designed to be superior at those ranges. When they encountered enemy tanks engaging them effectively at twice that distance, their entire tactical framework collapsed. They had no counter-tactic because their weapons physically could not reach the enemy. It was not a question of skill or courage. It was simple physics. The psychological dimension proved a significant tactical effect. Post-war studies of Japanese tank crew morale revealed that by early 1945, assignment to tank units in Burma was considered effectively a death sentence. Crews understood intellectually that their vehicles couldn't compete with Allied armor. This knowledge corroded unit cohesion and combat effectiveness long before actual engagements occurred. Several documented cases existed of Japanese tank crews abandoning vehicles before contact with Allied forces, choosing to fight as infantry rather than face the certainty of death in their outmatched tanks. The relatively small number of modified tanks deployed, never more than 16 operational simultaneously in the Burma theatre, achieved disproportionate strategic impact. Allied commanders discovered that the presence of even one or two of these vehicles in a tank formation fundamentally changed Japanese tactical behavior. Enemy armor would withdraw rather than engage, even when outnumbering Allied forces. This effect extended the weapon's influence far beyond its actual physical presence. Japanese intelligence couldn't reliably identify which Allied tanks were the modified variants until engagement occurred, by which time identification was irrelevant. Lessons from Burma informed Allied planning for the proposed invasion of Japan. Strategic planners assumed Japanese armor would be concentrated in defense of home islands, potentially in greater numbers than encountered elsewhere in the Pacific. The modified tanks' demonstrated ability to destroy Japanese tanks at standoff ranges became a critical factor in casualty estimates. Plans called for deploying hundreds of these vehicles in initial invasion waves, effectively guaranteeing Allied armor superiority, regardless of numbers of Japanese tanks committed to defense. The atomic bombings and subsequent Japanese surrender meant these plans were never implemented. But captured Japanese defensive documents, examined after the war, revealed that Japanese military planners had reached similar conclusions about the futility of using armor against Allied forces equipped with these modified British tanks. Some defensive plans actually called for holding armor in reserve until Allied forces moved beyond range of naval gunfire support, a recognition that Japanese tanks couldn't operate effectively anywhere Allied armor could deploy. Technical documentation preserved in British archives reveals aspects of operations that remained classified for decades. Ammunition expenditure reports tell a striking story. Between November 1944 and March 1945, these modified tanks in Burma fired approximately 890 armor-piercing rounds in combat. Of these, 287 rounds engaged armored target. Hit probability at ranges exceeding 800 yards was documented at 73%, a figure that astounded post-war analysts who had estimated hit rates would be closer to 40% at such distances. This exceptional accuracy stemmed partly from superior optics and gun stabilization, but also from an unexpected source. Crew selection and training protocols these operations. The British commander had recognized early that the weapon's limited ammunition capacity meant every shot needed to count. He instituted selection criteria that prioritized experienced gunners who had demonstrated consistent accuracy in previous engagements. The results of this selection process were documented in personnel records. The gunner who achieved the first kill had previously served in North Africa and had documented 17 confirmed hits from 23 shots fired in combat before ever entering a modified tank. His selection wasn't random but deliberate matching of exceptional personnel to exceptional weapons. This pattern repeated across all crews. Average prior combat experience exceeded 18 months compared to 6 months for standard tank crews. The psychological profile of crews also revealed interesting patterns. Medical officers attached to armoured units noted that gunners in modified tanks reported lower stress levels than their counterparts in standard tanks, despite higher value targets and greater tactical responsibility. The explanation documented in psychiatric evaluations centered on control and survivability. These crews could engage enemies at ranges where return fire was ineffective. This created perception of control over their fate that reduced combat stress even though they faced more dangerous missions. Japanese intelligence efforts to counter the modified tanks proved consistently ineffective, though not for lack of trying. Captured documents revealed multiple attempts to develop identification protocols for distinguishing modified tanks from standard vehicles at distance. The most elaborate scheme called for reconnaissance teams to measure gun barrel length using calibrated optical devices. In theory, the extended barrel would be identifiable at 1,500 yards. In practice, this proved useless. By the time Japanese observers could accurately measure gun barrel length, they were already within effective range. More critically, Allied forces had begun applying camouflage techniques specifically designed to disguise the distinctive barrel. Some crews attached false muzzle brakes to create visual confusion. Others wrapped extended barrels in vegetation or canvas sleeves. The few tactical successes Japanese forces achieved came not from superior tactics, but from extreme measures that proved unsustainable. In late January, a Japanese suicide bomber successfully destroyed a modified tank by approaching through dense vegetation and detonating his charge against the tank's tracks. The explosion immobilized the vehicle and killed one crew member. It was the only documented instance of one of these tanks being deliberately destroyed by Japanese ground forces in Burma. This incident prompted immediate tactical changes. Modified tanks began operating with dedicated infantry escorts when advancing through close terrain. Tank commanders instituted 360-degree security protocols with infantry specifically tasked with preventing close-range attacks. The modifications proved effective. No subsequent losses to suicide attacks occurred, though Japanese forces attempted the tactic at least 7 more documented times. Industrial logistics supporting operations represented remarkable achievement. The ammunition, significantly larger and heavier than standard rounds, required dedicated supply chains. Each armor-piercing round weighed 17 pounds compared to 14.6 pounds for standard rounds. Transportation, storage and handling all required modifications to existing logistics infrastructure. By March, the supply system was delivering approximately 1,200 rounds weekly to Burma theatre, sufficient to maintain combat operations while building reserve stocks. Maintenance presented unique challenges. The high-pressure firing regime created barrel wear rates approximately 40% higher than standard tank guns. Records documented that barrel accuracy began degrading noticeably after 350 to 400 rounds fired. Engineering units in Burma maintained stocks of replacement barrels and developed rapid barrel change procedures that could swap a worn gun tube in under 6 hours, comparable to engine replacement in complexity but achievable in field conditions. The human cost, even with the modified tank's superiority, remains significant in less obvious ways. Medical records from field hospitals treating tank crews revealed high rates of hearing damage from the weapon's extreme muzzle blasts. Many gunners and loaders suffered permanent hearing loss, particularly in their left ear, the side facing the breech during firing. Post-war disability claims filed by veterans consistently cited hearing impairment as primary service-connected condition. The strategic deception value exceeded tactical impact in some respects. Japanese forces, uncertain of how many modified tanks the Allies possessed, consistently overestimated their numbers. Captured intelligence assessments estimated Allied strength at approximately 60 to 80 vehicles, nearly 5 times actual deployment levels. This miscalculation influenced Japanese tactical planning, causing them to hold armor in reserve for fear of encountering overwhelming numbers. Armor that might have been committed to critical defensive battles instead remained static, contributing to Japanese defensive failures. Final statistical accounting, compiled by British military historians in 1947, provided comprehensive assessment. 16 modified tanks operated in theatre between November 1944 and August 1945. These vehicles participated in 47 armoured engagements, destroyed at least 73 Japanese tanks. Exact numbers remain uncertain due to incomplete Japanese records, and suffered 0 combat losses to enemy armour. 3 were lost to mines, 1 to the suicide bomber attack, and 2 to mechanical failures that resulted in vehicles being abandoned and destroyed to prevent capture. The cost-benefit ratio, measured both in lives saved and resources expended, mark these modified tanks as among the most effective weapon systems deployed in the Pacific theatre. The legacy extends far beyond immediate military victory. In the broader context of World War II armoured warfare, these vehicles represented critical evolution in military thinking. The recognition that technological superiority, particularly in gunnery, could provide decisive advantage even when deployed in relatively small numbers. This principle would shape armoured warfare doctrine for decades. Veterans who served in these crews maintained lifelong connections to the weapon system. Annual reunions held in India and Britain through the 1990s featured surviving tanks as centerpieces. Veterans spoke with respect about the weapon's power, but also acknowledged the burden it imposed. An instructor who trained initial crews reflected decades later that they knew they had an overwhelming advantage. That's not always as simple as it sounds. When you can kill the enemy from ranges where he can't fight back, you confront questions about fairness that don't arise in even combat. But war isn't fair, and their job was to win with minimum friendly casualties. These modified tanks did that better than anything else they had. Japanese veterans in their own post-war testimonies and memoirs acknowledged the impact with professional respect. A former commander, one of the few Japanese tank officers to survive multiple encounters, wrote in his memoir that these British vehicles represented everything they had failed to achieve in their own armour development. They combined adequate mobility, good protection, and overwhelming firepower. Japanese designers had focused on creating balanced designs. The British had focused on killing enemy tanks. In war, the side that kills the enemy's tanks wins. This is the lesson learned too late. Technical innovations pioneered with these modified tanks, particularly the concept of mounting the most powerful practical gun in an existing chassis, influenced post-war tank development worldwide. Soviet, American, and British designs all reflected the philosophy that gunpowder was the primary determinant of tank effectiveness. The medium tank as a category evolved from balanced vehicle for multiple roles to mobile platform for the biggest gun that could be mounted. This evolution began with these modified British tanks. Modern military historians recognize them as among the most cost-effective weapon systems of World War II. Conversion from standard tank to modified configuration cost approximately 1/3 the price of producing a new tank from scratch. yet provided exponentially greater combat effectiveness against enemy armor. In Burma, fewer than 20 of these vehicles neutralized Japanese armored capability across an entire theater of operations. The return on investment, measured in both economic and military terms, was extraordinary. Preserved examples in military museums worldwide stand as testament to the weapon's significance. Educational displays describe their technical specifications, but they often miss the human dimension. The Japanese tank crews who faced an enemy they couldn't fight, the Allied crews who bore the burden of overwhelming advantage, and the thousands of infantry on both sides whose fates were shaped by these armoured duels, the mathematics of dominance were brutally simple. The weapon could penetrate any Japanese tank at ranges where Japanese guns couldn't return fire effectively. This created a zone of absolute control, a killing ground where one side could destroy the other with virtual impunity. Modern military terminology would call this standoff precision strike capability. In 1944, soldiers simply called it devastating. These modified British tanks in Burma proved a fundamental truth about industrial warfare. Victory flows not merely to the brave, but to those who bring superior tools to the fight. Japanese tank crews were courageous, well-trained and determined, but courage cannot deflect armor-piercing shot traveling at 3,000 feet per second. Training cannot overcome a 600-yard range disadvantage. Determination cannot alter the physics of armor penetration. Modified tanks demonstrated that in modern warfare, technology multiplied by industrial capacity equals victory, regardless of human factors on the opposing side. At a reunion decades after the war, bringing together British and Japanese veterans, a former modified tank commander and a former Japanese tank commander met for the first time since the war. Through translators, they discussed the engagements they'd survived. The Japanese veteran asked directly whether the British veteran felt guilt having such advantage. The British veteran considered the question carefully before responding. He felt relief that he would go home, relief that his crew would survive. War isn't sport. There's no obligation to give the enemy an even chance. He wasn't proud of the advantage they had, but he was grateful for it. Today, the caves and valleys of Burma where these armoured duels occurred are peaceful. Local farmers sometimes uncover rusted tank components in their fields, fragments of Japanese vehicles destroyed 8 decades ago. These artifacts serve as reminders of when technological superiority proved decisive, when 17-pound shots travelling at hypersonic velocity transformed the nature of armoured warfare, and when Japanese tank doctrine met British gunnery and discovered that courage, however great, cannot overcome physics. Picture the thick, humid air of Burma in November 1944. The monsoon season had left the ground waterlogged and treacherous. Roads that existed on maps were little more than muddy tracks carved through dense jungle. This was a landscape that seemed designed to swallow armies whole, where visibility rarely extended beyond a few hundred yards, and where every tactical decision had to account for terrain that could turn a modern armoured vehicle into a helpless, bogged-down target. In this challenging environment, a Japanese tank commander sat in his turret scanning the approaches to a strategic town. Lieutenant Yamamoto had reason for confidence. He commanded one of Japan's newest and most capable tanks, a vehicle that represented years of development and lessons learned from brutal combat across the Pacific. Unlike the earlier, lighter tanks that had been systematically destroyed by American forces, this newer model was a genuine medium tank, comparable in many ways to Allied vehicles. Yamamoto had spent countless hours studying intelligence reports about American armor. He knew their standard gun could penetrate only so much armor at specific ranges. He understood the ballistic tables, the penetration curves, the angles of deflection. At 800 yards, his tank's frontal armor could withstand a direct hit from standard American weapons. This wasn't arrogance, but calculated assessment based on solid engineering data. Japanese metallurgists had finally developed armor plate of sufficient quality and thickness to provide genuine protection. What Yamamoto couldn't know, because Japanese intelligence hadn't yet pieced together the full picture, was that the tank maneuvering into position 900 yards to his left wasn't carrying standard American weaponry. It was a British modification of an American chassis mounting a gun that had been designed to defeat the massive German Tiger and Panther tanks on European battlefields. This weapon could punch through armor more than twice as thick as anything protecting Japanese tanks, and it could do so at ranges that made Japanese return fire essentially impossible. At 1341 hours, Lieutenant Yamamoto's tank ceased to exist as a fighting vehicle. The armor-piercing projectile didn't simply penetrate the armor. To understand what happened, you need to understand the physics of high-velocity anti-tank warfare. When a hardened steel penetrator moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second strikes armor plate, several things happen simultaneously. The kinetic energy, measured in millions of foot-pounds, is sufficient to force the penetrator through the metal like a nail through wood. But the energy doesn't disappear. As the penetrator punches through, it creates a shower of metal fragments from both the penetrator itself and the armor plate. These fragments, superheated by friction and moving at supersonic speeds, fill the interior of the tank like a horizontal blizzard of molten steel. Inside Yamamoto's tank, the crew had a fraction of a second between the sound of impact and death. The penetrator itself, still traveling at tremendous velocity after punching through the armor, ricocheted through the crew compartment. It struck ammunition racks, fuel lines, mechanical components, and human beings with equal indifference. The pressure wave from the supersonic projectile alone was sufficient to cause catastrophic internal injuries. The metal fragments, each one a potential lethal projectile, turned the interior into a killing box. Within 3 seconds, the compromised ammunition detonated. The explosion was so violent that the turret, a multi-ton steel structure, was blown completely off the hull and landed 20 feet away. This wasn't combat as Yamamoto understood it. This was systematic, mechanical destruction from an enemy he never saw, at a range where his own weapons were useless. In that single engagement, 3 years of carefully developed Japanese tank doctrine became obsolete. The tactical understanding that had guided Japanese armor operations, the training that crews had undergone, the confidence that had been built through successful engagements against earlier Allied tanks, all of it evaporated in 1.2 seconds. To understand why this moment was so significant, we need to step back and examine the broader context of armored warfare in the Pacific theater. When Japan entered World War II, their tank designs reflected their military experience in China and their expectations about future warfare. Japanese tanks were relatively light, with thin armor and modest guns. This made sense for their intended role, supporting infantry against opponents with minimal anti-tank capabilities. In China, these tanks had been devastating. They provided mobile firepower that Chinese forces largely couldn't counter. But the Pacific War proved to be entirely different. American forces deployed medium tanks with heavier armor and more powerful guns. Initially, this didn't create insurmountable problems for Japanese forces. While American tanks were superior vehicle for vehicle, Japanese tactics emphasized infantry anti-tank weapons, prepared defensive positions, and aggressive close-quarters combat where American numerical superiority was negated. Japanese tank crews learned to use terrain, to ambush from concealed positions, to accept high casualties in exchange for destroying expensive American armor. However, by late 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated dramatically. American industrial capacity was producing tanks at rates Japan couldn't hope to match. More critically, American forces had learned how to use their armor effectively in jungle terrain. The early Japanese successes in tank versus tank combat were becoming rare. Japanese high command recognized they needed better tanks to have any hope of contesting Allied advances. The result was a new generation of medium tanks that began reaching frontline units in mid to late 1944. These vehicles represented a genuine technological achievement for Japanese industry. They mounted high-velocity guns derived from successful anti-tank artillery pieces. These guns could penetrate 75mm of armor at 1,000 meters, which meant they could destroy standard American medium tanks at combat ranges. The armor protection had been substantially improved as well. The frontal armor, 50mm thick and sloped at 15 degrees, provided effective protection against standard American tank guns at ranges beyond 500 yards. This was a game-changer for Japanese tactical planning. For the first time since early Pacific campaigns, Japanese tank commanders weren't simply sacrificial lambs sent against superior Allied armor. They had vehicles that could fight on relatively equal terms. They could engage American tanks at combat ranges and expect to both deliver damage and survive return fire. Japanese commanders began developing new tactical doctrines that emphasized the capabilities of these newer tanks. In Burma specifically, this shift became apparent in October 1944. Allied tank losses began increasing significantly. British armoured regiments operating American-supplied medium tanks reported troubling encounters. At a battle near a town whose name appeared in after-action reports, 3 British tanks were destroyed in a single engagement. Post-battle analysis revealed all 3 had been hit by high-velocity 75mm rounds at ranges exceeding 600 yards. At those ranges, the British tanks' return fire had been ineffective. The Japanese tanks had been able to engage, destroy Allied armour, and withdraw before effective countermeasures could be employed. This trend was deeply concerning to Allied commanders. Tank losses in Burma increased by 34% compared to previous months. More worrying than the raw numbers was the implication. Japanese forces had finally fielded armour that required tactical finesse to defeat. The days of simple firepower superiority were ending. Allied forces would need either better tactics, better armour, or better weapons. Given the terrain constraints of jungle warfare and the difficulties in rapidly deploying new tank designs, the solution would have to be a better weapon. The answer arrived at Indian port facilities in early November 1944. 12 modified tanks had been diverted from European operations. To understand why these vehicles were revolutionary, you need to understand the problem they were designed to solve in Europe. When Allied forces invaded France in June 1944, they encountered German armour that was substantially superior to anything they'd faced in North Africa or Italy. The German Tiger tank, with its 88mm gun and thick armour, could destroy Allied tanks at ranges where Allied weapons couldn't penetrate Tiger armour. The German Panther medium tank was similarly formidable. British tank crews in Normandy found themselves outgunned and outranged. The standard British tank gun and the standard American 75mm gun simply couldn't reliably penetrate German heavy armour at combat ranges. British casualties were mounting at unsustainable rates. The British Army needed a solution that could be fielded quickly without waiting for entirely new tank designs. British ordnance engineers had developed a powerful anti-tank gun in 1942. This gun, firing 17-pound projectiles, had been designed as a towed artillery piece to counter German armour. It was devastatingly effective, capable of penetrating armour that shrugged off hits from standard tank guns. The challenge was adapting this large, powerful weapon to fit into existing tank turrets. The gun was enormous, with a barrel extending nearly 16 feet. The recoil forces were tremendous. The ammunition was bulky and heavy. Through ingenious engineering, British designers managed to install this gun into American-supplied medium tanks. The modifications were extensive. The turret interior had to be completely reconfigured. The recoil system required redesign to manage forces that would otherwise tear the mounting apart. The crew was reduced from 5 to 4 because there simply wasn't room for everyone with the massive gun breech taking up so much space. The commander had to assume loading duty in addition to his command responsibilities. Ammunition capacity dropped significantly because the 17-pound rounds were so much larger than standard 75mm ammunition, but the results were spectacular. In Normandy, these modified tanks could destroy German Tigers and Panthers from ranges where German gunners struggled to even identify targets. The gun's velocity was so high and its penetration so extreme that it could punch through the thickest German armour at distances exceeding 1,000 yards. More importantly, it could do so reliably. This wasn't a weapon that might penetrate under ideal conditions. This was a weapon that would penetrate nearly every time, regardless of angle or range within its effective envelope. Now, 12 of these modified tanks were being sent to Burma. The decision reflected Allied Command's assessment that Japanese armour developments represented a genuine threat requiring extraordinary countermeasures. The modified tanks were assigned to an Indian Army armoured regiment that had extensive combat experience in Burma. The regiment's commander, a British officer with service dating back to North African campaigns, immediately recognised what these vehicles represented. For 3 years, Allied armour doctrine in the Pacific had relied on overwhelming numbers and coordinated combined arms tactics. Infantry would suppress enemy anti-tank weapons while tanks advanced. Artillery would destroy prepared positions. Air power would attack Japanese strong points. Tanks operated as part of this system, not as dominant weapons in their own right. Individual Allied tanks weren't necessarily superior to individual Japanese tanks in close combat. Victory came through system-wide advantages, not vehicle versus vehicle superiority. These modified tanks changed everything. They weren't just better tanks. They were weapons that could destroy any Japanese armoured vehicle from ranges where Japanese crews couldn't effectively fight back. This created entirely new tactical possibilities. Instead of grinding through Japanese defensive positions with combined arms operations that accepted tank losses as inevitable, Allied forces could now destroy Japanese armour before it could ever engage. The modified tanks could provide overwatch, sitting in protected positions and systematically eliminating enemy armour at extreme ranges. But realising this potential required training. The weapon had quirks and limitations that crews needed to understand. Training began immediately at military facilities in India. The crews selected for these vehicles weren't random assignments. The commander had specifically requested experienced gunners with proven track records. He understood that the weapon's limited ammunition capacity meant every shot needed to count. There was no room for learning on the job or gradually improving accuracy through volume of fire. The training revealed several critical characteristics. In mid-November, Japanese forces launched a major counterattack against Allied positions. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese forces would commit at least one company of their newest medium tanks to support the assault. This represented the first confirmed deployment of Japan's most advanced armour in Burma. For Allied commanders, this was both threat and opportunity. The threat was obvious. Japanese armour operating in company strength could cause significant damage to Allied positions. The opportunity was equally clear. This was a chance to field test the modified tanks against precisely the targets they were designed to destroy. The British commander made an immediate decision. He would commit 4 of the modified tanks to combat despite incomplete training. His reasoning was sound. The Japanese armour posed a genuine threat to Allied positions. Standard tanks might stop the attack but would take casualties doing so. The modified tanks could potentially destroy the entire Japanese armoured formation without loss. Even if crews weren't fully trained, the weapon's overwhelming advantages should compensate for any skill deficiencies. 4 modified tanks moved into carefully selected defensive positions along the expected Japanese approach route. Each tank was positioned in what's called a hull-down position. The hull, the lower body of the tank containing engine, drivetrain, was concealed behind terrain features or dug into prepared positions. Only the turret was visible from the expected Japanese approach. This positioning provided several advantages. It minimized the target profile, making the tanks harder to spot and hit. It protected the vulnerable lower hull from direct fire, and it provided the turret full mobility to engage targets across a wide arc. Behind the modified tanks, 400 yards to the rear, standard medium tanks formed a second defensive line. These tanks were positioned prominently, visible from the expected Japanese approach routes. The tactical plan was elegant in its simplicity. 2. The modified tanks would engage Japanese armour at maximum effective range, targeting command vehicles first to disrupt Japanese coordination. The standard tanks would hold fire unless Japanese armour somehow closed to within 500 yards. This would maintain the deception about the modified tank's capabilities for as long as possible. Japanese forces might believe they were facing standard Allied armour until their tanks started exploding from invisible weapons at impossible ranges. The tactical plan reflected sophisticated understanding of how to maximize the modified tank's advantages. By positioning them in hull-down positions at extreme range, Allied commanders ensured that Japanese forces would have maximum difficulty identifying and engaging them. By holding standard tanks in reserve, they created a second defensive line that looked like the primary defense. Japanese commanders, seeing the standard tanks, might assume they understood the defensive layout. They would be fatally wrong. On November 17th at 13:44 hours, the Japanese attack commenced with an artillery barrage. For 12 minutes, Japanese guns pounded suspected Allied positions. This was standard Japanese doctrine. Suppress enemy defensive positions with artillery, then advance armor and infantry during the confusion following the barrage. It had worked in previous engagements. Japanese commanders had no reason to believe this attack would be different. When the artillery barrage lifted, Allied reconnaissance elements reported movement along multiple approach routes. The main Japanese effort appeared to be developing along the Central Road, exactly where Allied intelligence had predicted. Japanese forces were following their doctrine, massing combat power along the most favorable avenue of approach. Leading this advance were 6 of Japan's newest medium tanks, moving with the confidence of crews who believed themselves in technically competitive vehicles. The Japanese formation advanced at approximately 8 miles per hour, a reasonable speed for armor moving through monsoon-affected terrain. The lead tank navigated carefully around a curve in the road. The crew would have been scanning constantly for threats, looking for muzzle flashes, movement, anything indicating enemy positions. They were within their doctrinal engagement range. If they spotted Allied tanks, they could engage with reasonable chance of success. Everything about the tactical situation appeared manageable from the Japanese perspective. At 13:46 hours, a British gunner in one of the modified tanks acquired his target through his telescopic sight. The range was 920 yards. Through the magnified optics, he could see the Japanese tank clearly. The target was moving at slight angle, presenting not quite a perfect frontal shot, but close enough. The gunner, a soldier from Punjab province who had fired exactly 17 practice rounds during training, made his final aiming adjustments. At 13:47 hours and 12 seconds, he squeezed the trigger. The gun fired with tremendous blast, the recoil rocking the entire tank backward. Dirt and debris exploded from the muzzle, creating a massive dust cloud. Through this dust cloud, the gunner maintained his sight pictured just long enough to see the result. The armor-piercing projectile, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, crossed the 920 yards to target in just over 1 second. It struck the Japanese tank's turret ring, the junction between turret and hull, at slight downward angle. The kinetic energy at impact exceeded 2 million foot-pounds. To put this in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to a fully loaded semi-truck hitting a wall at 60 miles per hour, except all that energy was concentrated in a projectile, roughly the diameter of a soda can. The Japanese tank's 50mm armor might as well have been paper. The penetrator punched through effortlessly and continued through the fighting compartment at supersonic velocity. Inside the Japanese tank, death was instantaneous.